Welcome back to Harbour Unboxed. It is time for our Q&A series. I don't actually recall the last time we did this, quite a while ago.
At least not here. We did one at Computex, but then before that here, it's a long time ago. Not much has been happening.
Must be at least 3 months since we got...
I think so.
Yeah. So anyway, August. Crazy August Q&A, isn't it?
Yep.
That's wild, yeah. The year has flown. I don't know how, because there hasn't been much going on. But anyway, lots of great questions, it looks like, for this month's Q&A series. Probably going to be a 3-part series. This is, of course, part 1. So we're going to get into it. But before we do... Today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly and their CryoSheet graphene thermal pads, which are an excellent alternative to thermal pastes. They offer very high thermal conductivity with no liquid components, so they can't dry out and therefore don't degrade over time like pastes and even liquid metals. CryoSheet is very easy to use, it's extremely durable, and is available in a range of sizes to suit most applications. I've personally done some high-end GPU testing with CryoSheet, and the results were impressive, very similar in fact to that of liquid metal, but without the mess, and of course, no risk of drying out. So for more information, please check the link in the video description.
Why do you think that the generational performance increase of Zen 5 over Zen 4 was so small compared to other generation-to-generation jumps? Is it that the Zen 5 architecture is reaching the limits of what its design can do, or is it simply complacency on AMD's part, given the mindshare that they have achieved with, say, the X3D parts and Intel's recent struggles?
Sort of my gut feeling on this, and from what we can work out based on all the available information, is it's probably neither of those things. I think it's more just a change of focus, or at least a more direct focus on stuff like servers, development software, AI. I think that's really where they've tried to hone that architecture and make it useful for that, because probably where the money is, more so than gaming and general desktop usage. I mean, general desktop usage, there's probably not much that needs to be gained there. Of course, we always like to see higher FPS numbers and improved performance, and less likely to see your games CPU bound, because we have seen some new AAA titles where they tend to be more CPU bound than what we would typically see. Normally, you go high res, high quality settings, and it's all on your GPU, but that hasn't always been true. So yeah, some gains there would have been nice, but ultimately the 9700X is basically a 7700X for gaming. I think that's pretty well sorted at this point in time. And yeah, I guess you can say it's not really for us, which is fine. I don't have a problem personally with AMD going after efficiency gains, as small as they may be, improving for server workloads, all that sort of stuff. Don't really have a problem with that, do we? I guess it's more the reviews landed the way they did because of the way it was marketed and pitched to us. As it was sort of, I mean, they had gaming-focused benchmarks. They were making pretty bold gaming performance uplifts, which are, in hindsight, difficult to understand why, when there's really no gaming gains to be had almost universally. There's a handful of games that we see a nice little game, but most of them pretty low, which is why you see tech media outlets like Tech Power Up showing 2%. We were 3%. I think Gamers Nexus were around that as well. So, and I think most media outlets showed small gains. So that's really it. There's no mystery. I know whenever, for an example, when Zen first burst onto the scenes, which you were probably just finishing up school or something, primary school at the time in 2017.
Sure, yeah.
Tim may not recall, so I'm getting at. No, you probably do. When Ryzen first came out and it had more cores, and I think the thing that really confused people as well was the big Cinebench scores. It was really good productivity performance that really rivaled or even crushed Intel in a lot of instances on the desktop, but the gaming performance was almost nowhere. So you still had much lower core count Intel CPUs that were providing much better gaming performance because they were clocked higher. They supported, I think, in most instances, higher frequency memory, certainly lower latency, and that's where Zen Plus was quite a nice little bump, because it addressed things like DRAM latency, a little bit of core-to-core communication latency there as well, but I think DRAM was the big one that provided the gaming boost there. So I guess what I'm getting at is, at the time, people were like, we need an investigation. Everyone was so confused. Why is Zen kind of sucking for gaming? And I guess we've seen that with Zen 5. Like, there was all these different avenues. Like it's Windows. Windows is
Yeah.
Intel bias. Like Intel's paid Microsoft to make Windows better for their CPUs. No, it's the game developers. They favor Intel CPUs because Ryzen's a new architecture. Games might have been optimized and developed for them. And look, a little bit of truth in all of these things, but there was no really one thing that accounted for it. Essentially, it was the architecture wasn't very good for gaming because of latency penalties with DRAM. And we're saying that was Zen 5, right? It's just, there's no SMT, PBO thing to explain why it's not good. It's just, it's not focused for gaming.
It's definitely the architecture. And I think as you have gone back and looked at some of the older architectures, you mentioned Zen wasn't great for gaming.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of those architectures that came after Zen and saw these big performance gains, there was a lot of easy things that they could have improved in the architecture to improve gaming, which is why I think we saw such large gains. So, for example, those early Zen architectures had the split CCD design with 2 CCXs. So as you were trying to communicate across 4 cores to 8 cores, you got this latency penalty because the cache was split, everything was split inside. And so that was solved with the future Zen generation. They increased the core count on the highest parts from 8 to 16. They, with Zen 4, they gave us DDR5 memory. They've improved the memory controller to support faster memory speeds. They've increased the frequencies of the parts. They made V-cache parts, so they actually just gave you more cache in general. And all of those things improved the performance for things that we care about, which is gaming and general desktop workloads. Whereas Zen 5 is a very targeted architecture, and you talked about it being targeted towards servers. There's not a lot of frequency gains. There's very much no frequency gains with this architecture. It's on the same process node, so they're not getting significant efficiency gains because it's still using the same process family. I know it's 5 nanometer versus 4 nanometer, but it's the same effective process family from TSMC. It's using the same I/O die. So there's been a lot of theories about the I/O die potentially limiting some of the memory bandwidth and interconnects and those sorts of things. The Infinity Fabric is virtually unchanged compared to Zen 4. So when you've got this targeted design that only has improvements in some areas, that's where you see like people testing AVX 512, they see these huge gains because they targeted that. They added that to the CPU to make it faster. And then the gaming side of things that we normally associate architectural improvements for game like cache capacity, cache latency, DRAM frequency and bandwidth, and those sorts of things, no improvements. So yeah, I think that's part of it. The previous Zen architectures were broader gains applied more across the board to various different areas of the CPU, and Zen 5 is more targeted. So maybe future Zen generations will continue these more targeted approach. So maybe one generation you'll get the CPU core overhaul, the next generation you'll get the I/O die overhaul, and potentially a future generation, I don't know, maybe that focuses on cache capacity or something like that. So yeah, advancement sort of slows down when you have hit all those easy targets and you're trying to find new things to look into. So I think all those things explain why we've seen what we've seen.
Yeah, that's right. That's really it. I've seen a lot of people commenting saying, oh, it's the early BIOSes. BIOS revisions will improve gaming performance, or there's fundamentally something wrong with the microcode. They'll address that and that'll boost gaming performance. And while I'm not saying that's entirely out of the question, it just seems unlikely because, as we've said, it's not focused on improving gaming performance. So therefore, there's not inherently something wrong with it. It seems like there is because of AMD's marketing, claiming that, parts will beat 14900 KSs and all kinds of CPUs that you wouldn't necessarily expect them to beat, and they don't. So I think that's what the confusion is there, thinking, well, AMD wouldn't have claimed, I think it was the Ryzen 9 series could beat the 14900K or KS. AMD wouldn't claim that if it wasn't true, so there has to be something wrong. I can't explain those slides and why AMD went down that path. I really can't. I just know for a fact it was never on the table. That wasn't what they were aiming for. That wasn't what it was designed for. There was some sort of disconnect there with marketing and what they actually had. But AMD themselves seemed as confused as everyone else as to why the gaming performance wasn't what they thought it was. How that sort of thing happens, can't tell you guys. It makes no sense. All right, Tim, how good would Arrow Lake need to be for you to recommend it so shortly after Intel's Raptor Lake issues? And this is a pretty good question because I've actually thought about this in the.
Yeah, I mean, from one angle, I can sort of say, well, can we trust Intel and what they're saying after how they've handled the Raptor Lake situation?
Well, it hasn't even been handled yet. Like there's a microcode update.
Sure. I think when I say handle, I mean how they've sort of dealt with the problem so far, which is not great.
Yep.
So, if they came out and they said, Arrow Lake doesn't have this issue, it's like, do I believe them or do I not believe them? Because you could make a case either way, right? A lot of the statements that they've made throughout the Raptor Lake situation have not been great. So, yeah, there's a lot of trust loss there. On the other hand, I sort of think, well, in some ways, it's a new product generation. So maybe we shouldn't assume that there will be problems until there's evidence of them having problems. So from that angle, I guess there is reason for it to be considered a fresh start. But then, of course, it would need to have all the performance benefits and those sorts of things expected of a new generation, all those sorts of things. So yeah, that's sort of how I'm thinking of it. I could sort of go either way. I'm sort of probably more leaning towards the fresh start angle than, we wait to see if there's evidence of issues. Then
I think the fresh angle or fresh start angle, really you need to have a successful generation under your belt to regain the confidence of the consumers before people are going to jump on. So
I think consumers definitely will not jump on.
Yeah, and that's sort of the question. So I guess unless Arrow Lake is definitively faster than, say, the Zen 5 X3D chips and the Zen 4 X3D chips, if they're clearly if they by a, it doesn't have to be a huge margin, but by a reasonable margin, reclaim the performance crown for gaming, because obviously that's what we're mostly talking about here, and still has great productivity, performance, and reasonable efficiency. They don't have to win efficiency; it just has to be not absurd. Using like 100 watts more for gaming, for similar gaming performance.
I think Arrow Lake would struggle to sell if there weren't any stability issues, though, under a situation where they're not in some sort of performance leadership position. We've seen with some of the previous generation parts that prior to these stability issues coming out, Intel had reasonably competitive pricing for a lot of parts, and they weren't in the leadership performance position necessarily, especially for gaming, but they had other strengths like productivity, performance, and those sorts of things, and they weren't exactly selling that well. So if Arrow Lake was another repeat of that, plus stability concerns in the previous gen...
It's because they weren't taking the AMD approach of recognizing, okay, let's be honest with ourselves here. We are not the performance leaders. Like, we're not in that position right now. We want to get back to that position. But so to generate sales, what do we have to offer here? Great value. We have to undercut the competition to a point where, and they're probably, they might be able to do that. I mean, it's their own firm and whatnot. But anyway, that's essentially what they have to do. If they can't knock AMD Zen 5, Zen 4 CPUs off, if they can't knock them off, period, I suppose, they need to offer much better value. And they have done that at the low end, where AMD seems to have abandoned that.
Zen 4 pricing is kind of...
we'll see what happens Zen 4 is doing that. So it's... Yeah, I guess with that happening as well, it's going to be tough. So...
I think it's... I always think about, like, what is a position of a product that's going to change a buyer's mind from what they're already thinking of doing. And I think the current state where things are at the moment is most people will be going, let's just buy an AMD CPU. Stability issues, I don't want to deal with that. I'll just buy AMD. It doesn't matter the Zen 5 is a little, not very impressive. We'll just get whatever the AMD CPU is. So how do you change that with the stability issues in the background? And obviously they're going to have to make it so compelling that you would be making at least a toss-up in your mind. Like, the AMD CPU might be more stable and provide a few additional things, whatever they may be, but the Intel CPU is, 15% faster and 20% cheaper or something. That's probably a bit much. They're probably not going to offer that, but you know what I'm saying? Like, it's faster and cheaper or something like that.
It has to, like, how good does it have to be? Very good. It has to be very good. For Intel to recover quickly, has to be very good. So what exactly that means is, we'll see when the reviews come out and what it ultimately ends up being, but the reviews have to be very positive. It has to be a great product. All right, Tim, I smell a VRAM question. So
okay.
let's get into it. Black Myth Wukong, a game I'm pretty sure you're familiar with. The benchmarks seem to be crushing GPUs without going over 8 gigabytes of VRAM. Do we know this is due to developer optimization, engine optimization, or tech like direct storage being utilized? Has the VRAM apocalypse been postponed?
Right. So I think when it comes to Black Myth Wukong, there's a very simple explanation for why the game doesn't use more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM in some configuration. It can use more than 8 gigabytes if you enable the usual VRAM taxing settings, so like your frame generation, ray tracing. Those at 1440p and 4K will push you over 8 gigabytes. You probably need a 12 gig GPU for that. But the simple reason with this game is that the texture quality isn't that good. That's just the simple reality of that game. A lot of the focus on the visuals has been the lighting system, so the use of Unreal Engine Lumen and also path tracing, and the world density, so the amount of trees and things that you see in the game world is quite high.
Which is, I think that's the most impressive part about the game.
Yeah,
well,
that makes the game look really realistic and lifelike. But then if you look closely at some of the textures used in the game, it's just not that impressive. There wouldn't be what I would describe as high resolution textures, and you'll see that across some of the trees, the rocks, general surfaces, and it's really noticeable in areas where the lighting system or the density of the game world isn't there. So there are sections where, there's no light sources creating those, nice shadows and global illumination effects. It's just a general scene, and then you look at a rock and you're like, okay, yeah, it makes sense why this uses less than 8 gigabytes of VRAM. So
I always find that one of the most disappointing aspects of a game as well, because a game like that will suck you in. Like, initially you get in the level of detail and the environment's like a bit breathtaking, like, wow, this is amazing. And it invites you to have a closer look because you're so taken back by how it looks. And then you'll want to take a closer look and start really inspecting the environment. And you walk up to a rock and you're like, oh, okay, I am playing a video game. That's that kind of spoils it. And again, that's something that we've wanted to see in games is better texture quality. But at the same time, we can't really hammer the developer about that too much because most people have 8 gigabytes of VRAM still, which is why we've been advocating for mainstream GPUs for ages now to have more VRAM, and really they should. There's no reason why they can't, apart from money.
I mean, to be fair, with a game like Black Myth, there are settings that you can't run on mainstream GPUs anyway, like path tracing. So I would have thought that
that's what I was going to
get to. A high VRAM setting makes sense in the same vein. It's like, people with 8 gig GPUs can't run that, but 8 gig GPUs can't run path tracing anyway. So it's kind of like provide those sort of settings. But then again, it is the developer's first game, so how many resources they wanted to dump into it.
Probably more resources go into creating higher textures than they do adding ray traced effects, would be my guess.
Yeah, and there's a lot of variety to the scenery and stuff in the game. There's many different biomes and things, so each chapter is a different environment design. That's why the game is like 120 gig. And so if you're thinking about, we can implement path tracing across the game, maybe that's one setting, or change all the textures. You can see why they'd make that call.
That's right. And even then, that would have to be, like you see in games like Far Cry 6, an HD texture pack.
Yeah.
Because it would make the base game so massive. And if a lot of people are only, have 8 gigabyte cards, for example, and are only using medium quality textures, they're downloading a significant portion of the game that's just not relevant to them. So, there's all these sort of reasons for why. But it would be nice to be able to take advantage of all these graphics cards now that we're seeing with 12, 16, and larger VRAM buffers. But other games we've talked about in the past, Cyberpunk, that's often lauded for being such a great-looking game. And it is a good-looking game, but again, the texture quality in Cyberpunk isn't great. It's pretty flat, pretty bland in a lot of ways. And if you look back through time, the games that I think have aged really well, like, people keep saying, back in the day, games looked better than they do now, which isn't true, but there are games that have aged really well, and it's almost universally because they used really high quality, at the time they were photorealism textures.
Combined with the material quality so that lighting is bouncing off them realistically. And that can often be, I think of a game like when I was playing Dead Space last year, whenever it came out, the remake, and you'll see on those surfaces there's sometimes like multiple textures where there might be like a metal pole with some blood splattered on it, and the reflections on the metal versus the blood are different. Whereas if you use more basic textures and more basic materials on the surfaces, you don't get that interaction, so it doesn't look as good.
Yep.
And I think, games like Black Myth suffer from not having as much of that in them.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm yet to sort of see a game where the texture quality is really good, but also the game runs with less than 8 gigabytes of VRAM. It's not that common, especially for like the best, most impressive texture quality settings. And even today, when we're talking about games like Black Myth, they still will not run on an 8 gig GPU with all the bells and whistles enabled.
Yep.
And that's the case with a lot of those other games that we've tested over the years, where you turn on ray tracing or frame generation or both, and it takes an 8 gigabyte game to running over 8 gig.
Yeah.
So it's
almost a chicken and egg situation, though I think the hardware does have to lead.
Mm-hmm.
And I do believe if we had 16 gigabyte GPUs as the mainstream offerings at this point in time, which we certainly could, 7600 XTs exist and whatnot, the games would look better. They would have higher quality textures, which is why we keep pushing for you guys. This is misunderstood a lot. We're not saying don't be poor, buy an RTX 4080 or whatever, get more VRAM. That is absolutely not what we've ever said or claimed. It's not, this guidance isn't necessarily targeted at you. It'd be good to buy, a 16 gigabyte 4060 Ti over the 8 gigabyte model. If you have to buy that GPU for whatever reason, then get the 16 gigabyte model. But these VRAM specific videos are targeted at AMD and Nvidia. And I guess we're trying to educate the audience to demand more VRAM rather than just having 8 gigabytes crammed down your throat for the next 5 years, because that's all you need. But yeah, as for the VRAM apocalypse as well, I mean, there's so many examples. I've got a couple here, we've seen Doom Eternal, Resident Evil 4, the Callisto Protocol if you want to enable ray tracing. Horizon Forbidden West is a gorgeous looking game that huge difference between a RTX 4060 Ti 8GB and 16GB at highly playable frame rates. So that's a game where you really do want at least 12GB of VRAM if you want to use the very high preset, and especially dabble with technologies like frame generation. The Last of Us Part 1, obviously, classic one there. Ratchet and Clank, that's a really good example. That's another good looking game that likes a lot of VRAM. And then there are other games that have flown under the radar that have a lot of VRAM related problems, but they're not necessarily frame stuttering problems. They're more image quality problems. And they're like Halo Infinite and Forspoken, for example. So there's plenty of games that you can point to already. It's not really, I don't think the 8GB thing hasn't been a future problem for a long time. It's a here and now problem. And it's a complex one. I could really talk about this from so many different angles for an hour or so, because it is a subject that people seem to take the wrong way. Because, you can just lower texture quality settings and voila, it's problem solved. And I think for those of you with more affordable, like what we say, $300 GPUs or less, then that's a perfectly acceptable thing. But when you're being sold $400, $500 US graphics cards that support technologies like ray tracing, that's a key selling point of that product. Get it because it has ray tracing, get it because it supports frame generation. And we're seeing more and more of these key technologies require more and more VRAM. And when you can't use those technologies because you don't have enough VRAM, that's a problem. So that's why we're advocating for those middle of the road and up products to have really a minimum of 16 gigabytes of VRAM. And we're advocating that on behalf of gamers, not telling gamers to spend more money. So anyway, there's a lot more to it, but that's the quick and dirty summary. So we'll move on. All right. Do you guys use HDR? If you do you use Windows Auto HDR, NVIDIA's Auto HDR tool, or only turn on HDR when the game supports it natively? Well, I'll just quickly answer mine because it's probably a quicker version. On my main gaming PC, my main work PC, I don't use HDR. On my home theater PC, I do use HDR, so have that enabled on the TV, the PC. I find it really good there. But yeah, for my general desktop usage, it's sort of a pain in the backside, so I don't bother with it there.
And for multiplayer gaming, it's not exactly something that you want to have enabled. I mean, for me, I generally play games with HDR enabled. I don't really use Windows Auto HDR or RTX HDR. The issue there is that usually those technologies make the UI too bright. So there's potential for degrading an OLED if your UI is being run at 500 nits when it probably shouldn't be. So those technologies probably need a bit of work to improve those areas. And that's something I've been messing around with games like Starfield that when it came out didn't natively support HDR. So you could use like Special K and those utilities to add in HDR. But then I tested I'm like, the UI of this game is very bright because the UI is white. So it turns the non-HDR white to like super bright white. I'm like, don't really want my UI to be hurting my OLED. So generally I keep it to the native game implementation. There's a few exceptions where I've messed around with RTX HDR and Auto HDR, but generally speaking, a game kind of needs the native presentation for it to look the best. So yeah, I am a fan of HDR. I think it's a really good feature that improves the visual substantially if you have the display to support it. But yeah, hopefully those sort of auto tools can improve a bit to get where it needs to be.
And here I was thinking you were gaming with sunglasses because you were cool. Now we know it's because of your HDR mods.
Yeah, that's right.
I've seen a lot of talk about RAM issues / instability with this release / AMD. So I guess Zen 5. Can you explain a bit more about it? Does that mean only slow RAM is compatible, or that certain brands of RAM don't work? So again, this has to be a Zen 5 thing.
Yeah,
that's how I'm going to address it anyway. I haven't seen too many reports. I mean, I know Gamers Nexus had a couple of CPUs that didn't work and they had a multitude of memory problems. But with these, I don't know, beta BIOSes, if you want to call them, the Americans didn't understand either of those words. When these CPUs first get rolled out, you're going to see compatibility problems. It's just, that's par for the course. It's how it goes. My understanding is that nothing has changed there. So once BIOSes are updated and the memory compatibility stuff is addressed, it's the same integrated memory controller, same memory support. Ideally, you want to use DDR5 6000 at a 1-to-1 ratio. So nothing should really change there. I've had no problems. My Zen 5 CPUs have worked the same as Zen 4. Admittedly, I've only tried a couple of boards with a couple of memory kits, so could have got lucky. But I don't think there's really anything to talk about here. It should all be the same. It should work the same. So once motherboards get up to speed and get all updated and the compatibility testing and all that sort of stuff is done, then it should carry on the same way.
Yeah, and this really seems to have been pretty close to when these CPUs were manufactured. Mm-hmm. So while there have been BIOS updates for a lot of the boards for a while, it is possible that, these motherboard manufacturers haven't gotten final samples in until very recently. Mm-hmm. And that's the case that we've seen with a lot of CPU releases that, you kind of have to wait a couple of months for the initial issues to sort themselves out, but then usually they are sorted out. And towards the end of this year, I think people have no problems at all. Mm-hmm. How linear would you say VRAM requirements on PC have historically been? Do you think they just gradually increase with time, or would you say they quickly increase sometimes and at other times plateau? Do you think those times of quicker development align in some way to console releases? So I think, it probably does come in bumps as we see the requirements, the sort of the baseline available hardware increase over time. So consoles obviously one thing that developers target a lot of. I think as we saw that switch over from generations, a lot of games quickly went from, say, 4 gig to 8 gig back in the day, and then more recently from 8 gig to like 12-ish gigabytes for sort of the flagship games, especially the games that aren't on last generation consoles. So if you look at the titles that are just for your PS5, Xbox Series consoles, a lot of those have heavier VRAM requirements. And then obviously as GPUs improve their VRAM capacity, we have seen games start including high resolution texture packs and those sorts of things. But I think if you just restrict it to the very best visual looking games, it tends to be more of that linear progression. There tends to always be every year a couple of games that really push the limits of what's capable on PC, and those usually use more VRAM. It's not always the case, but some of the best looking games do have high VRAM requirements. So, I think the majority of games, it falls more to the step progression as hardware requirements increase. And then, for those top-end titles, bit more linear. But, it's something that you've got to keep a lookout over time because things do keep going up and up and up. So you don't want to have some stagnation, which has kind of been the case for the last little bit, unfortunately.
What is the maximum price premium you would accept or you would pay for Zen 5 over Zen 4? So what's let's give a specific example, like the 9700X over the 7700X. If you were in the market for a 7700X, which I think 290, I want to say.
Sure. Yep.
And then I think it's, what was the MSRP for the 9700X? It must have been God, I forget now. Was that underwhelming?
I don't think the MSRP even matters. It's what the price is now.
That's right. So, at what point would you buy a 9700X over a 7700X in terms of like the price, obviously?
So, I mean, the minimum based on the performance that you've shown would be no price premium. I don't think it can be more expensive. I think that you just wouldn't really purchase it. I mean, even if it was like a 5% premium for 3 to 5% more gaming performance, it isn't exactly making me go, gotta buy that. I'll definitely choose one over the other. So it'd be a toss-up there. And I'm assuming with this question, it's like, what price would be needed for me to definitely buy the Zen 5 part? Mm-hmm. In which case, I would have thought it just being the cheaper processor would get me to buy it. So you're looking at two parts. You're looking at two parts that are pretty much the same in terms of all the angles that you've looked at over the past couple of weeks, things like efficiency and overclocking abilities and the actual performance for general tasks that someone buying a consumer part would use them for. So your desktop stuff, gaming, those sorts of things. Memory support's pretty much the same. Features is pretty much the same. So I don't know why I would spend more money on that part, or at least not more than a very small margin. To me, it would have to be, the cheaper processor.
Yeah. Sadly, I agree with that. I've tested a lot of games now, and there are quite a few games where the 9700X is slower than the 7700X by varying degrees. I think if the 9700X was universally faster, even if it was only a little bit faster, then you're guaranteed a little bit more performance. But it could be a case whereas the game you're playing, you do lose a bit of performance. So, I think continuing on from the current Zen 4 pricing structure is where Zen 5 would need to be.
Yeah, that's right. And it puts them in a difficult position because there's still Zen 4 stock, so they still have to sort of weigh up how do we sell 7700Xs and 9700Xs at the same time when both parts are very similar. So that's obviously difficult for AMD, but that's their problem, not our problem. So they've got to figure that out. And
it's a massive problem as well. I can't go into specifics, but I've spoken to a few retailers and distributors, and boy, has Zen 5 flopped. I mean, my title could not have been more accurate on that one. I mean, I was talking about it from a different angle, but in terms of sales, I don't even know what word you would use to describe just how dismal and dire the situation is. The numbers compared to so Ryzen 5000 series, that sold incredibly well the day/night of release, depending on where you were. I suppose morning as well as in there. But Ryzen 5000, day one, sold in incredible numbers at a lot of our retailers here in Australia. The 7000 series also sold quite well. Not nearly as well because price premium for motherboards and memory and all that sort of stuff, but still sold well. The 9000 series, you can basically say, relative to past Zen series, and even I think anything in terms of sales, it didn't sell. Like the volume that retailers moved was near enough to zero that you might as well say it didn't sell. Crazy stuff.
Yep.
Well, for the previous generations, we're talking at most retailers like thousands of units sold on day one. Within a week of sales, Zen 5 sold near enough to zero, which is pretty wild.
So the pricing is wrong. Pricing needs to come down, and it's going to be difficult because I've been looking at Zen 4 pricing, and that is coming down as well. So,
based on all of this Zen 5 Zen 5 pricing is going to fall faster than the predicted 7900 XT price drops. It's going to drop quick and rapid. So that's the same word. It's going to drop quickly. That's what I'm trying to say. All right, we're going to hit pause there on part 1 of the August Q&A. There will be a part 2 and a part 3 coming up, so make sure you're subscribed and all of that stuff, and even like the video while you're here. Why not?
Sure.
That maybe does something.
Yeah, we don't ask for a like too often, but I don't know. Does it help the
Sometimes
algorithm?
I say like and subscribe because I'm a true YouTuber.
Yeah,
So,
sure. Yeah,
you know,
yeah, makes sense.
I do the job right. But yeah, I mean that was a lot of fun. Great questions there. A lot of different stuff, I think, compared to what we've been sort of getting asked over the last probably year, at least the last few months anyway.
Last few years seems like a lot of predict the future questions, but now that the future's here with Zen 5, it's kind of
people are like,
sort of
stop predicting the future. We don't want to know about the future anymore.
The future arrived and it was disappointing.
Yeah,
so.
don't give us any more disappointing news. Or Steve and Tim, can you lie about the future? So anyway, maybe we'll lie about the future in part 2. So as I said, make sure you're subscribed for all the upcoming lies. But yeah, that is going to do it for this one. Thank you for watching. I'm your host, Steve.
I'm your host, Tim.
See you again next time, maybe. Hopefully, please.